Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Good morning. I hope you're doing well. It's a real honor to be with His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, who just returned from a historic trip to Europe. You spoke at the Munich Security Conference, the first time ever that a true representative of the Iranian people spoke at that conference. This is a very important international event, usually attended by Islamic Republic officials such as Javad Zarif. You also spoke at the European Union, where you urged the Europeans to list the Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization. You spoke in the UK. There were some incredible scenes in the United Kingdom where you were greeted by hundreds of your compatriots. And you have been urging maximum support for the Iranian people for 44 years, Your Excellency. And I think this is one of the reasons that Iranians see you as their true representative. When you were in Europe, you urged the Europeans to invest in the Iranian people. Can you just tell us what you exactly mean by that? What are some of your recommendations to the Europeans? And also, we want to know, there's a lot of concern among Europeans that when the Islamic Republic falls, that there may be instability in Iran, there will be uncertainty. So if you could just talk to us about how the Europeans should see the situation in Iran, and why they should believe that Iran has a bright future under a secular democratic government.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today, Nufti. I appreciate your invite and this opportunity to speak to all of you here today. The most fundamental issue that could be on people's mind, foreigners looking at Iran, is they say one thing: well, this is the devil we know when they talk about the regime, but yet we don't know what could come after. And first and foremost, if they look at the composition of various Iranian diaspora living in foreign countries, particularly European and Western countries, what type of people are they? Are they successful? Are they educated? Do they have talent, know-how? Are they managing corporations or running half of their own countries? Why would they have any doubt that these are the very same kind of people who tomorrow would lead and build their own country? Let us not forget that the first wave of Iranians who had to flee Iran, who were the initial or first generation of immigrants, came here, and today maybe the third generation are my own children, for instance, my youngest daughter being of that age, pretty much the same age of this whole Mahsa revolution, and they're represented. What kind of people are they? What kind of values do they fight for or die for? The same values of liberties and freedoms that we enjoy here in democratic countries. And we want the exact same thing for us. So if you put in doubt that the same people that need to be saved and help get rid of this regime would be different in character and nature and values than your own countries, then don't even bother looking at us. But if you do, what the hell are you waiting for? Because the most instrument for change, if it has to be from within, cannot be anything other than the people themselves. So therefore, why maximum support? Because when you are dealing with an extremely repressive regime, and we all know what it does to people, it would be very difficult to sustain continuous resistance to this regime without some added element that gives people hope for the future, that the end of this regime is near, that the world is finally recognizing that the Iranian people are part of the solution, while this regime continues to be part of the problem. Years ago, I've been arguing to the very same countries and Western nations that I visited recently, that your entire basis of foreign policy regarding Iran, including the sanctions, were based on a false premise and expectation, which was behavior change. This regime has proven that its DNA, its reason to exist, has nothing to do with the national interest of a country and its people. They are there only to export an ideology. at the expense of the Iranian people. And for them to succeed, the rest of the world has to fail. It's zero sum. They cannot have actual coexistence with a world that is democratic when human rights are the element and basis of laws and rules. And as such, expecting them to change their behavior has been such a waste of time. And yes, because in some cases it was mishandled elsewhere, doesn't make regime change a bad concept. It was poorly executed in Iraq. And by the way, Iran is very different than Iraq. So why is it that what we are asking today governments to do is to understand that the element of change has to be first and foremost the Iranian people. And if you respect a nation's sovereignty and right to self-determination, that's exactly what we are asking for. What are we fighting for? I've been fighting 43 years of my life to get to the day we can have Majlis Muassasan propose a constitution to be ratified by referendum by the Iranian people. That's what our objective is. And if we believe in democracy, if we believe in the sanctity of the ballot box, it is our job to ensure that Iranians are not deprived of that right and that choice. That's what we are fighting for. But we need help. And in that context, my message had been, and again, in this round of talks, what was different was that it was the first time they finally decided to officially enter in open dialogue with representatives of the secular democratic opposition. Until now, their dialogue was limited to the regime and its representative. And we kept arguing, how could you possibly expect to have an answer to the problems by asking those who are continuously part of the, get an answer to a solution from the people who are the problem. We can offer you the solutions. But it's also another aspect we talked about, bipartisan support here. It's very important. I remember a few months ago I was in California and I was talking to a group of my fellow compatriots, and I said, we should take a book out of the experience that the Israelis have had. That when it comes to Israel, we expect bipartisan support for our country, regardless of you're Republican or Democrat. As the Iranians living in this country, I had the same ask. Say, make sure that your ask, whether you're voting Republican or Democrat, is we don't expect anything short of bipartisan support when it comes to Iran and our freedom and human rights. So that's very important. The same approach I took talking to legislators in Europe and saying that as much as we will give you a diversity of the Iranian secular democratic opposition, we would like you to also provide us with as much diversity within your own respective political parties. So we're not in dialogue only with one side of the aisle versus the other. And that's also very important because we don't want, again, the Iranian issue to become an issue of partisan politics, whether it's in Germany or France or England or wherever. And that was also very important. So I think that given the fact that this is fairly new, to be honest, for the first time they're beginning to hear us, it would take a little bit of time for us to be able to put all the nuts and bolts together, but this is a process that we are going through. As I speak to you right now, I can see much more coordination between Iranian opposition groups trying to work with one another at this stage. I can see a lot of specialists who want to enter the field and provide their ideas either before the transition or especially after the transition and a roadmap for the future of Iran. For instance, when I was in in Oxford, that's particularly the kind of things we were talking about with the students, Iranian students who came from Cambridge as well. And we were talking about how important it is to have a lot more project-oriented actions, because it's easier to recruit for specific projects, whether you want to focus on legal issues or economic issues or environmental issues. And that is also necessary because, yes, we all understand the importance to have a democratic country in the future. But I think many Iranians are asking themselves the question, well, what's the roadmap to recovery? And on that basis, the rest of the world must also understand what's the roadmap to recovery and what's in it for them and what could be of mutual advantage. So these were, in that sense, quite a successful trip that I had as a first round of talks, so to speak, and I hope to continue on that together with other friends who are helping in this process and hopefully inform our fellow compatriots as to how we are progressing on that.
It's really great to hear that. I remember traveling to Europe several years ago to advocate for a policy of maximum support for the Iranian people. And I remember when I met with European Union officials, when I told them that I believe the Islamic Republic will be overthrown, they didn't believe me. And so you going there and getting that sort of reaction from them, to me, is kind of like a dream come true, frankly. What do you think it will take for the people across the street to change their minds about Iran, to shift their focus? You know, I would have never thought that Europe would be more open toward a policy of supporting the Iranian people than my adopted country, the United States. What will it take for the White House and the US Congress change its mind about Iran? When will people in this town wake up to the reality in Iran?
You brought up one element which I think is key in the process of transition, which was designating the IRGC as a terrorist organization. Why is that important? It's not only important because obviously curtailing them makes the regime less capable of using it as an apparatus of state repression at home or whatever they do abroad. It's also important because those of you who have followed my arguments all these years understand that I've always campaigned and advocated for a non-violent civil disobedience means of change as opposed to having recourse to arms and conflicts of that nature, which usually doesn't end up with a democratic alternative and brings the cost of change so much higher that it is unjustifiable. It is important in the sense that other than it could provide more assets, because let's not forget, the IRGC is now a mafia that rules the country, controls just about everything. Curtailing them means perhaps even more resources that could be repurposed, as we talked about today, about frozen assets and what have you. But it also will give more incentive to members, the core of the IRGC, to consider when it's time to join with the people and bail out with the system, because they cannot be associated with that kind of designation. It will, in fact, in my view, accelerate the process of defection, which is something we need. Because in order to have a policy of national reconciliation, we have to offer the bulk of them an exit strategy. And if they do not find in the future a place for themselves, they'll be forced to resist with the regime. And that, again, is costly to the country. So understanding that that scenario could, in fact, facilitate a more peaceful transition could not possibly be against the interests of any country, understanding that the change will need to happen, but how it will happen. It is important for them to understand that, as a consequence, we are talking about a controlled implosion as opposed to anarchy at the end of the day. That's the part that I think they need to begin to trust and understand, the mechanics of change. And as we have opportunities to explain how this can happen, as we can tell our own people why it is that they have to find a place beyond this regime. I'm not talking those who have committed heinous crimes and they will have to account for it. Them are just salaried people. They have to make a living. We cannot have the de-Baathification disaster that happened in Iraq happen in Iran. That's very key. We need to understand it as a people. The world needs to understand it when they look at us, and we need to communicate very clearly that we have an actual strategy and plan for that transition. I think that's the part that perhaps hasn't been looked to as seriously as it should have, but now that we're getting to this point, I think it is time to explain exactly what are the components for it and how this role could be important, among other things.
That's very interesting, controlled implosion, because usually Western officials don't view Iran in such a manner. And as you said, you've been a leading advocate of nonviolence in Iran for decades. And I think that's very important for everybody to understand that the solution in Iran is civil disobedience, economic strikes, teachers walking out of the schools. What should we expect American officials once the JCPOA ends? I think one of the biggest problems with American policy has been this hope, which I think is completely unrealistic, that the nuclear agreement can be revived. And I think the Europeans have begun to see the light as the Islamic Republic has really stepped up its support for Russia and Ukraine. European officials have changed their policies, and I think there could be a time when America realizes that also it's time to change its policies because the nuclear agreement is completely dead. When you look at Iran, what do you see as the next phase of this national revolution? And people constantly ask me that have the protests in Iran died down? Why aren't there people coming into the streets? What do you think it will take for the next phase of the revolution to really demonstrate to the world that the people of Iran will succeed against the Islamic Republic and lead the country to a future democratic system?
Well, on the first issue, very quickly, it's like you can have a gun and it has a safety that you can put on, of course. But the problem is not the gun. The problem is the finger on the trigger. So whatever you want to have as an argument, if JCPOA is that safety on the gun, and you think you're going to be safe now? No, it's the same finger who's going to put the safety of whatever they choose and pull the trigger anyway. Can you trust such a system after so many times cheating on whatever they had agreed to before? So that's that, and I'd rather focus on the second part of your question. Look, it is almost impossible for nations of the world looking at a country and its evolution to expect people at that level of excitement being on the streets every single day for months at a time. It's unrealistic, nor is it in that sense necessary. Because the protests had to send a clear message to the world that we want an end to this regime. Now, would you rather see our children be shot in the eye or poisoned by chemical attacks? Or if they were to stay home, nobody can force them out of their homes if they choose not to show up for work, which is why we are aiming for a strategy of maximum support that would lead to financing key sectors within Iran of the labor forces that can bring the final shock and paralyze the system to collapse. It can be done quickly enough, because if it's too long, the nation could also suffer from it a little bit. So the timeline could happen in a matter of a month or 2 months, maybe, of intense support. And if you do the math, we're not talking about billions of dollars. Imagine that 100,000 workers at an average salary of between $300 to $500 a month were to do it for 2 months at a time. You have a number right there. We're not talking billions here. So, and the funding, I mean, the money is there, if you come to think of it. And the delivery mechanisms, there are several ways to do it. I won't obviously unveil the details in front of the camera so the regime can find out about what we're planning to do. So obviously I won't do that. But there are ways of doing it. And it's important because let's not forget in 1979, or before 1979, in the mid-1978, what finally brought the maximum pressure on the previous regime was the oil workers going on strike. Today, if you have transportation in Iran interrupted for a while, the whole system will come to a standstill. The regime won't be able to operate. People are already defunded. Our currency has been devalued to a point that it's, I don't know which way it's going to end up. So it's not like before people were arguing, you know, the sanctions are going to hurt the people, or it's going to do this, it's going to do that. Well, look at where we are at now. At the time of the Green Movement, where were we at? 4,000, 5,000 riyals, 2 months to the dollar? What?
Yeah, 1,000.
1,000. What we are?
Now it's like 45.
So, well, you get my point. You get my point. The point is that this situation is unsustainable, but the solution is not to remove sanctions. It's in fact to push more for the regime to disappear, so all of the problems at the same time disappears, not just the nuclear threat, everything else that we talked about earlier in the previous panel. But most importantly, it puts the people who can solve Iran's problem back in a seat. These people have been ignored by the regime. Specialists, a direct quote, that's what he said. And look at where we are now. So 80% at least of whatever will constitute the mechanisms of transition and rebuilding the country are already in Iran. They are already there. They don't have any posts. بلکه همه آقازاده ها همه جا رو گروه کردن. So the potential is there. And look at the role that members of the diaspora can immediately contribute to, bringing investment, bringing industry, bringing technology. That's the easy part. That's actually the easy part. You know what I'm most worried about? It's a cultural change. We need a new political culture. And that's not going to happen overnight. It's an educational process. But we have the other ingredients in place. And in that context, the world can then see that the country is not devoid of natural resources. It's not devoid of talent, from managers to directors to researchers to you name it. We are way ahead of many countries in Eastern Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union who had to restart. Much sooner than them we can do that. And then they will recognize that the sooner this is done, they can address their own immediate concerns even more. I think two main issues that was discussed in Europe, at least in the talks that I had, were the two obvious problems that they're facing. One is energy dependence and energy requirements. I just use one word, gas, Iranian gas. Iranian gas for decades could supply Europe so they don't have to be threatened by the limited choices they have right now in terms of energy needs. So Iran can solve that problem right away. Also immigration. Immigration is a huge problem for Europe. Europe is already saturated. They can't accept any more refugees. And if the situation in Iran were to continue, albeit for water crisis that Iran is facing right now, more people will have to be displaced. Where are they going to go? Many of them from the region may again head towards Europe. That cannot accept any more refugees, and it creates much more domestic issues for them as well. And you can stop that process and perhaps even reverse it. So these are the two immediate, tangible benefits that the Western countries can have in a change of regime in Iran that can have an immediate impact and reduce their concern. If they begin to see the light of how easily they can eliminate so many problems they've been facing because of the regime in place, but also how quickly they can benefit from what that change would mean to them, which is, I think, win-win, because the Iranian people will, of course, benefit from that. The sooner can we get back on track for rebuilding the country and getting the economy going on again. It will create employments at home and stability in the region, as well as reducing all of the concerns that, I don't know about the US, how far they will be impacted by that change, but Europe in particular will be most immediately impacted by that.
Yeah, you've been talking about a strike fund for a very long time, and I think that's a very key tool to use against the Islamic Republic. Right now, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of strikes going on in Iran. They have been going on for years, and that sort of civil disobedience, I think, is very effective. We've seen it in other countries. For example, the Solidarity movement in Poland was very successful in crushing communism through civil disobedience, and a similar method can be applied to Iran as well. When I talk to a lot of people in Washington, D.C. And in the Middle East, there is also concern for regional security when the Islamic Republic collapses. Of course, a lot of people in the Middle East want the Islamic Republic gone. Iran's neighbors have suffered immensely from this regime. This regime is responsible for the genocide in Syria and many other horrible acts. But while the Middle East wants this regime gone, there's also concern about what comes next, what kind of new Iran emerges out of the ashes. What's your message to the people of the Middle East? What can they expect from a secular, democratic Iran?
When you bring an element that reconciles our society in the sense that this regime from the get-go established a policy of discrimination against women, first and foremost, the first victim of this regime, they became second-class citizens, discrimination against religious minorities, discrimination against the LGBTQ community in Iran, discrimination against ethnic groups and what have you, basically you can define the regime as being inherently one that only has a very narrow vision of itself at the expense of 95% of the Iranian population. So when you have a democratic country where all faiths will be free to practice what they want, nobody will question what sexual orientation you have or what political ideology you have, pluralism in the true sense of the word, and if you exercise it in your own country, the ramification of that vis-a-vis your immediate neighbors cannot be anything but positive, as opposed to a regime that wanted to create a modern-day Shiite caliphate. And the first challenge was to the Saudi royal family of whether or not they are the legitimate custodians of the Holy Mosque. It started from day one. So the Sunni-Shia conflict was in fact started by the Islamic regime in Iran, which obviously had been a big problem for our Arab neighbors. So obviously, if that element is gone, not only will they see that we are a nation of tolerance and we would like to have fruitful and cordial relationship with our neighbors because it is in our own interest, that will be an element that will create immediate relief and stability. And we'll be cooperating with our neighbors towards that goal. We have so many common issues to tackle together. It's not just an Iranian problem, it could be a regional problem. We can all work on that. So that demeanor, that kind of a change in attitude should be something that I don't see why it would not be welcome by any of our neighbors. But it's also something internal to us Iranians, which I like to emphasize. We have had 40 years of experimenting directly with a religious dictatorship. The issue of religion today in Iran, or for that matter, the argument about secularism, is today an understood argument. It was taboo to talk about religion 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Today it's not the case. So I think we are coming out of the tunnel and understanding the necessity of separation of church from state, as they say it here, as a prerequisite to democracy, number one. But also in that finding our Iraniyat in contrast to Islamiyat doesn't mean that in order to be a nationalist, we have to be anti-Arab or anti-Islam or anti-anything. Why should we anti-anything? And that's what we need to project. And that also goes back to that culture that I'm talking about. The traditional culture of conspiracy theories or چشمابی‌ها و همه چیزی دست انگلیس‌هاست و you know what I'm talking about. All those kind of arguments, as opposed to, come on, let's grow up. It's the 21st century. If we can all be educated, let's do away with all these conspiracy theories. Let's be pragmatic and realist and understand that as long as our national integrity and sovereignty is respected, we will treat anybody who treats us that way the same, reciprocally. That's the basis of cordial relationship. And the most important thing, how many democracies have gone to war against each other in recent history? Democracies don't go to war against one another. Non-democratic countries do. So if we can be successful in having a democratic alternative in Iran, at least Iran will no longer be perceived as a troublemaker, but as the peacemaker. Iran will be seen as a country that actually contributes to more tolerance and more understanding, as opposed to bigotry or racism or fascism or anything that comes out of it. That should be our task as Iranians to say we are proud to say today in the 21st century that our country can be, in fact, a real model for many other countries to follow. And I think we have that capacity. All that we need is to actually believe in that for a change, actually believe in ourselves for a change. Because we've been so humiliated, we have been so beat on the head, that sometimes I see that people are a little bit, how can I say, disheartened or not so sure. And yes, the element of trust has almost disappeared, and building trust back is very important. It's not an overnight affair. And the countries are successful, and nations are successful, and people are successful where they actually have faith in their own system and establishment. That's our domestic challenge, to make people actually believe in their institutions, believe in their own system, and know that they're responsible in preserving it. Not be passive. They can't be just spectators. They have to own it in order to control it, in order to participate in it. And the minute we start doing that, I think we have actually started on a very positive and new journey, learning from all the experiences, of course, that we have acquired over decades, especially under this regime.
You're the first Iranian leader that I've ever heard talk about LGBT issues. And I think it's important for the world to realize that the national revolution in Iran is a truly progressive movement. We want Iran to make progress, the sort of progress we saw under your father and grandfather. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you so much for speaking to us today, and it's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Nader. Thank you all.